Hey everyone, so today's lecture is about geologic hazards, and specifically we'll be talking about volcanoes and earthquakes. So let's start off with volcanoes. Remember, volcanic eruptions have a source material, and that source material is molten rock. So our igneous rocks are forming from these volcanic eruptions or from volcanic environments if we have extrusive igneous rocks, right? So remember, molten rock, once it hits the Earth's surface, we call it lava. And so volcanic eruptions are dealing with lava. And then when we're thinking about volcanoes, we also have to consider the viscosity of that lava. And the viscosity is the tendency within a body to resist flow. That's the fancy definition. And that means that when we have high viscosity, the liquid, the magma, the lava is stickier. And so a good example is if we compare water and syrup. Water has a low viscosity, it flows really easily. Syrup has a higher tendency to resist flow, it's stickier, and so it has a higher viscosity. And the molten rock viscosity, right? So the viscosity of a magma or of a lava depends on the temperature of that molten rock, the composition of that molten rock, and the amount of dissolved gases within that molten rock. So with temperature, as we increase temperature, we decrease the viscosity. If we have hotter magma, then we have a magma or a lava that likes to flow more easily, right? It's more watered down, it's liquidier, it likes to flow easily. And as we decrease the temperature, we increase the viscosity, right? It's not going to flow as easily when the temperature is lower. So for example, if anybody puts their syrup in the microwave, right, and heats it up a little bit, when you increase the temperature of your syrup, you decrease the viscosity of it, and so it's easier to pour on your pancakes. So the composition of the molten rock is also important to determining viscosity. When you have higher amounts of silica in our molten rock, then we have higher viscosity. So higher amounts of silica, remember, those are our felsic lighter colored minerals that we see in our igneous rocks. Basically, silica makes really long chains, and all those chains, as they're in this liquid, get stuck together and make the liquid stickier, right? So higher amounts of silica means long chains that get stuck together, which increases the viscosity, right? It's a stickier magma when you have higher silica. So when we have our darker colored igneous rocks, our mafic rocks, like basalt, they only have about 50% silica, and felsic rocks, like granite, have more than 70% silica. So basaltic lava flows much farther and faster than granitic lava. And then as we increase the amount of gaseous water in our molten rock, we actually decrease the viscosity. So as you increase the amount of gas in your magma, you're going to make it flow more readily, right? Less sticky, more flowy. And that's because that gaseous water actually helps to break apart those silica chains, which are increasing viscosity, right? So with temperature, if you increase temperature, you decrease viscosity. If you increase silica, you increase viscosity. And if you increase gaseous water, you decrease viscosity. We have two different types of volcanic eruptions. We have quiescent eruptions and explosive eruptions. I also sometimes call quiescent eruptions quiet eruptions because it's just an easier word to say and remember. So our quiescent eruptions deal with low viscosity magma. So our more basaltic lava, our mafic lava, our darker colored lava with less silica. And our explosive eruptions have higher viscosity magma, or those more silica-rich molten materials with the long silica bonds that increase the viscosity. So with our quiescent eruptions, because we have low viscosity magma that's pretty liquidy, right? The gas is easily able to escape because you have this liquidy, easy to flow lava. But in higher viscosity magma, the gases get trapped and they remain dissolved because they cannot readily escape because it's more of a sticky liquid. So when we have eruptions with quiescent volcanoes, the eruption column can get to about 300 feet tall in the form of what we call lava fountains, which you can see in this picture down here a little bit of some lava fountains. But explosive eruptions have huge eruption columns up to 25 miles in height, right? So our explosive eruptions are these sort of classic ones that we are intrigued by when we are kids. But with our quiescent eruptions, we have eruptions that are lasting for weeks or even years. And with our explosive eruptions, it's much more shorter lived, right? So you might have a series of explosions over a short time period, and then that volcano is dormant for a really long time. So an example of a quiescent eruption is the Kilauea volcano in Hawaii. So the Hawaiian volcanoes are a quiescent eruption with low viscosity magma and lots of lava flows that have been flowing for weeks to years. And then an example in recent history of an explosive eruption would be Mount St. Helens in Washington State. All right, so volcanoes can also extrude different material, right? They erupt and create different material during these eruptions. So they spit out, right? Extrude, spit out lava, gas, and what we call pyroclastic material. So lava flows are one of the things that volcanoes extrude. And there's two different types of lava flows. We have fluid basalt lavas. Again, these are our lower viscosity lavas, our basaltic fluid lavas. And then we have higher viscosity rhyolitic lavas. Right, so our fluid basalt lavas can flow anywhere between 30 to 1,000 feet per hour. So this isn't to say, I mean, that's pretty fast, right? Like this can destroy houses and things, and maybe not want to be like taking a nap by a fluid basalt lava flow. And then our viscous rhyolitic lavas have movement so slow you can't even perceive it. And these lavas at the most can only travel a few miles away from their vents. With our basaltic lava flows, we have two types of flows. We have aa, which has a rough and jagged surface. Right, so you can see how rough and jaggedy the surface of this lava flow is. And then we have a flow called pahoehoe, which is smooth or ropey. Right, so here's a pahoehoe lava flow. And the joke we always learned when I was going through school is if you walked on this barefoot, if you stepped on an it's rough and jaggedy, so you'd say ah. So that's the way to remember the difference between the two types of basaltic lava flows. And pahoehoe is a little hotter than so you can actually have a pahoehoe lava flow that then cools off and turns into an lava flow. All right, so magmas have something called volatiles, which are just dissolved gases held within that magma due to the weight of the earth on top of that magma. And this can make up to 6% of the entire weight of that magma. And most of it's water vapor. And these volatiles from volcanic eruptions can last in the atmosphere for years. Right, so all of this steam that you see coming off from volcanic eruptions is these volatiles that are no longer held by pressure, so they erupt, right? So think of like in your can of Coke that all that carbon dioxide is held under confining pressure, and then you pop the lid and the carbon dioxide starts to fizz out, and that's what makes it, carbonated. Same thing happens with magma, where it's under pressure, and then that pressure is released during the volcanic eruption, and those gases are able to escape. All right, and then the third thing that volcanoes extrude are pyroclastic materials. And we also call pyroclastic materials tephra, which is just lava and glass fragments that have hardened. And this is usually during energetic eruptions, right? Our explosive eruptions, this is when we are creating pyroclastic or materials or tephra. And there are 3 different sizes of pyroclastic materials. Ash is powdery, and we get this when we have gas-rich, really viscous lava eruptions. And ash is dangerous. You don't want to inhale ash because it's essentially glass shards. Lapilli are peat walnut-sized material, right, produced during explosive eruptions. And then blocks and bombs are much larger, apple to refrigerator sized material that's extruded from an energetic volcano. And blocks are just pieces of hardened lava that has cooled mid-air during this eruption. And then bombs are streamlined, right? So as they're flying through the air, they get streamlined a little bit. They kind of turn into these little bomb-shaped pieces of rock. So they're like super cool because they cool very quickly during the explosive eruption as they're flying through the air. All right, so when we're thinking about volcanoes, we have 3 different classifications of volcanoes. We have shield, composite, and cinder cone. And the way that a volcano looks, the side view of a volcano, is a function of magma composition. So going back to that viscosity, right? What the magma is made up, how viscous it is, creates these 3 different types of volcanoes. So first, let's talk about shield volcanoes. And shield volcanoes are named because they look a bit like a warrior shield if you look at them from the side. Right, so they have this broad, slightly domed shape. You can see someone standing on Mauna Kea, which is a shield volcano. Here are the Galapagos Islands, which are volcanic islands from space. Shield volcanoes are made up of low viscosity, or you can think of them as that more fluid basaltic lava. Because it's low viscosity and more fluid, it can travel really far and really fast from the vent. And then you can also get hardening of the outside of the lava flow, but it's still melty inside. And so that liquid part inside can travel far, being protected from the air by the hardened outer part. And that's what we call lava tubes, right? So you can make these really long tubes of hardened stuff on top, but liquid stuff inside, right? Like even like a little, kind of like a little straw out from the main vent of the volcano. And so this basalt can travel miles and miles. And there's usually a large steep-walled caldera at the summit or at the middle of the volcano. So you can see these calderas here in this Galapagos Islands picture. And so two really good examples of shield volcanoes are the Galapagos Islands and the Hawaiian Islands. The second type of volcano are the smallest, and they are cinder cones. And cinder cones are built from ejected lava fragments. This is more of a single eruptive event of lava that gets ejected and cools into pyroclastic material. And that pyroclastic material builds up around the place of eruption, but it doesn't stick together very well. And so lava doesn't flow from the top of it like you would normally think of a volcano. Instead, it flows from an unconsolidated base, right? So these cinder cones are made up of just pieces of pyroclastic material that aren't stuck together. And so the lava can't flow from the top, it has to flow from the bottom. They have really steep sides. And so what that means is that they look really interesting on the landscape when you see them, because they look kind of unnatural because they have these really steep sides. They're relatively small and they commonly occur in groups. And the best example of cinder cones are in Piracutin in Mexico, which basically these eruptions popped up. We had this sort of single eruptive event that took over the town, and this town, and like lava flowed all over the town, destroyed everything in the town, and then it hasn't been active since that one eruptive event. And then the third type of volcano are composite volcanoes, or they're also known as stratovolcanoes. And these are the ones that are like your classic volcano, right? So thinking about when you used to make volcano models as a kid, and when you see volcanoes in movies, commonly they are composite volcanoes. And these have a large cone shape, and the cone is actually built up of layers of ash and other types of tephra, and then lava, right? So it's kind of like layered, like a layer cake, a lava flow, and then an ash layer, and then a lava flow, and then an ash layer. And some examples are Mount Vesuvius, Fiji, Rainier, so sort of those big classic looming volcanoes that have these really explosive eruptions through time and then are dormant for a really long time, are composite volcanoes. Okay, so now let's talk about earthquakes. Earthquakes are just vibrations of Earth, and they are caused by sudden movement of rocks that have been strained beyond their elastic limits. And that's just a fancy way to say that we have two big chunks of lithosphere. Remember back to our plates when we talked about plate tectonics. And at those transform boundaries where those plates are slipping past each other, sometimes they get friction that kind of prevents them from moving in. They can bend a little bit elastically, but then once they're strained beyond those limits, right, they reach their limit and they can't bend anymore, that pressure, that friction gives way, and then you have a slip or sudden movement along that fault, and that causes the Earth to vibrate. So here's a picture of, we have movement along this little fault. It's bending, and then it reaches a point where it can no longer bend anymore, and it breaks or ruptures instead, and that all of that energy released, and that energy releasal is what creates an earthquake. So this energy release occurs as waves, and those waves are what actually generate the vibrations of an earthquake. And we have 4 different types of seismic waves. So we can classify these earthquake waves, which we call seismic waves, into 2 classes and 4 types. So 2 of the types of seismic waves are what we call body waves. And these waves move through the body of Earth. One of those is a P wave or primary wave, and the other body wave is an S wave or a secondary wave. So our body waves are seismic waves, earthquake waves that are moving through the body of Earth, right? They're moving through the inside of Earth. And then the other 2 types of seismic waves are what we call surface waves. And surface waves move over the Earth's surface, right? They can't go through the inside of Earth. They have to just move on the surface. And one of those are Rayleigh waves and the other are Love waves. So P waves are formed through the process of compression, and these are the fastest body waves. And P waves are able to travel through solids, liquids, and gases. So formed through compression, where you push motion and then that motion moves on in the form of a wave. We will model each one of these types of waves in the lab to help you see what this movement looks like. The important thing to know about P waves is that they can travel through solids, liquids, and gases. S waves, which are our other type of body wave, are formed by shear motion. So they're formed by motion up and down instead of side to side. And these are the slower of the 2 body waves. And the important thing to know about S waves is that they can only travel through solids, right? So P waves, our primary waves, can travel through all states of matter. S waves can only travel through solids. Rayleigh waves, our first surface wave, cause shaking in earthquakes in a vertically oriented elliptical pattern, right? So they create these rolling waves, sort of like the waves are generated in an ocean. And these occur where our P waves, our primary waves, intersect with the surface of Earth. And they're very slow and destructive, right? Both of our surface waves are destructive because they're happening at the Earth's surface where, humans are hanging out. So we see them as destructive because they're destroying a lot of our buildings and infrastructure. And then love waves are waves that cause the Earth's surface to move from side to side, sort of slithering like a snake. And this happens where S waves are intersecting at the surface. And so the motion of the wave is perpendicular to the direction that the wave is actually traveling, right? So the motion of Earth, this slithering motion, is perpendicular to the direction of the wave, which is actually traveling this lengthwise. And again, love waves are surface waves, so they are slow and destructive. All right, so the cool thing about earthquakes is that the way that earthquake waves travel, particularly primary and secondary waves, those waves that are traveling through the inside of Earth, through the body of Earth, they can tell us about what the inside of Earth looks like. So these seismic waves passing through Earth can be refracted, right? Diverted in different ways that show that the Earth has distinct discontinuities or distinct differences inside of it. So this is how we know that Earth has a core, right? We've never been to the center of the Earth to see that it has a core, but we have inferred, or we know that the Earth has a core and that the inner core is solid and the outer core is liquid, because we can understand these patterns of seismic waves passing through Earth to figure out that we have a differentiated planet. All right, so if we didn't have a differentiated planet, all of the waves would just travel in straight lines through Earth. They wouldn't be reflected or refracted. But we have a differentiated planet, which means that those waves get bent or refracted as they pass through different materials, changing in structure, right? How rigid they are, whether they're a liquid or a solid. And so we can use these seismic wave deflections or refractions to understand the different layers of the inside of Earth, right? So remember, we have the lithosphere, which is the solid outer part, the asthenosphere, which is the plastic portion of the mantle that the lithosphere rides on. And then we have a liquid outer core and a solid inner core. And we know this with two pieces of evidence. One is that we have something called an S-wave shadow zone. And so if we have an earthquake here at 0 degrees, scientists all over the world measuring these earthquake waves, if you're on the other side of the Earth from where the earthquake occurs, from 103 degrees to 103 degrees away from that point source, your machines do not record any S waves because you're in what's called the S-wave shadow zone. And this shadow zone can only be explained if the outer core of Earth is liquid. And that's because our S waves cannot travel through a liquid. So S waves can't travel through a liquid. They can't travel through the liquid outer core. And so they hit the liquid outer core and then they can't travel anymore. They just stop. And so if you're on the opposite side of the Earth from an earthquake, you won't receive any S waves on your seismograph. And then the second piece of evidence for Earth's differentiation is from the P wave shadow zone. So our P waves, which are also body waves, also have a weird deflection happening in the center of Earth, where if you are between 103 and 143 degrees away from the earthquake, you will not receive any P waves. And this has to do with that there's a solid central core through which P waves travel relatively slowly because it's very dense. So P waves can travel through the solid inner core, but because it's so dense, they get slowed down and deflected. And so you get this shadow zone, right? So we can get this complex pattern because there's lots of refraction happening inside of the Earth to these P waves. But we can use our S-wave shadow zone and our P-wave shadow zone to infer that we have a solid inner core and a liquid outer core. And then how P-wave velocities change through Earth's interior, we can calculate the density of the crust and the mantle as well, right? So we can understand the core, mantle, and the crust from these seismic waves. So sometimes we do get P waves into the P wave shadow zone due to reflection off the inner core, but these are usually weak indirect signals. But again, that's additional evidence for an inner core that is solid. Cool. So how do seismologists determine where an earthquake occurred? So seismologists are just scientists who study earthquakes, use a piece of equipment called a seismograph to measure earthquake waves. There's lots of different versions. Some of the older ones are based on the concept of inertia, where you have like a hanging weight and then a pen on paper. And as that weight moves with the motion of the Earth, then it like writes a squiggly line on that paper. You might sometimes see these even like in museums, like if there's delicate stuff, they put seismographs near delicate things like in art museums or in natural history museums to make sure that you are not causing too much disturbance to those artifacts. More modern seismographs are based on magnets instead of using like this inertia weight, but it makes a similar recording, and a lot of seismograms, which are what the recordings we have of Earth shaking, are based on these squiggly lines from those older models. All right, so some vocab words you need to know about earthquakes are that the focus of an earthquake is the initial point of rupture of movement along the fault. So usually this is deep within the earth, along a boundary where two plates are moving next to each other. And then the seismic waves are radiating away from this focus. But the epicenter, which is usually the word you hear more often in the news when people are talking about earthquakes, is the point on Earth's surface directly above the focus, right? So epicenter is the point on the Earth's surface directly on top of the focus or directly above the focus. And we care about the epicenter because it's the place on Earth that we can pinpoint geographically and say, this is where the earthquake occurred below, and it's the closest possible point to the focus, so it's going to be the place that has the most intense wave action from that earthquake. All right, so remember that seismic waves travel at different speeds, and P waves are the fastest. So down here we have our seismograph. Right, these squiggly lines are showing how much the Earth is moving. And our P waves always arrive first, right? So we have no movement, and then our first sign of movement is our P wave down here. And S waves arrive second, but they usually have a little bit of a higher amplitude. They're usually a little stronger than P waves, right? Because instead of this motion, accordion motion of P waves, we have this motion of S waves, so they're a little stronger, causing a little bit more movement. Right up here, we have our P wave moving through compression, our S wave squiggling along. So our P wave arrives first, and then there's a period where we just receive P waves on our seismograph, and then our S wave arrives. It's a little stronger, right? So those are our two body waves. And then the difference in time between when the P wave and the S wave arrives is called the SP interval. And then for a while we have to wait, and then our surface waves are going to arrive last, but they have the highest amplitude because they are shaking the surface, right, where your seismogram is sitting. And then depending on where your seismogram is, whether you're at station 1, 2, or 3, these timings are going to be different, right? The closer you are to the epicenter or focus of the earthquake, the shorter amount of time you're going to have between the actual rupture at the focus and the arrival of your P and S waves. The farther away you are, the longer it will take the waves to get there, and the longer interval between them you will have. All right, so here we have 3 stations with earthquake waves, particularly our P and S waves. So you can see station 1, station 1 is closest, right? So our P wave arrives, and then we have a relatively short P to S time before our S wave arrives. And as we move farther away, station 2 is a little farther away. P takes longer to get there. This interval between the P and the S wave is longer. And then the farthest station away, station 3, our P wave takes really long to get there. And then we have a long interval until our S wave gets there. So the closer you are to the focus of the earthquake, the closer together your P and S waves will be, and the less amount of time you have to wait from the initial time of the earthquake for those waves to arrive at your location. All right, so remember P waves move faster. So a P wave can travel the distance of the red line in the time it takes an S wave to travel the length of the yellow line, right? So P wave's traveling almost twice as far. Here we have our earthquake at the star, and then we have town A, B, and C, where we have a seismograph for each there. So our earthquake happens, and then we have waves traveling away from our earthquake. P waves are traveling faster than S waves. So here at time 1, sorry, I'll go back 1. We have our P wave has traveled this far, and the amount of time our S wave has traveled this far. Our P wave arrives at town A, and then our S wave arrives at town A later, right? So here's our P wave arrival, and then our S wave arrival. And then if we keep going, we see, okay, here's where our P wave has arrived at town B. Our S wave's not there yet. Keep going until now our S wave has finally arrived. The P wave's traveled that much farther already, even though they started at the same place. So we have this longer interval before our P wave, and we have a long SP interval before our S wave arrives. And then if we keep going for town C, you can see how that distance keeps getting larger and larger. All right, so the closer you are to the source of the earthquake, the closer together the P and S wave arrival times will be. And because of that, the difference between when the P wave and the S wave arrives, that SP interval, can tell us how far away the epicenter of the earthquake is, which is really cool. And so we can use diagrams like this one, and using, okay, we know that it took, let's say, 10 seconds. We have an interval of 10 seconds between when our P wave arrived and when our S wave arrived on our seismograph. So we know that the epicenter was 80 kilometers away. All right, so we can tell how far away an earthquake's epicenter was using one seismogram. So if we have 3 seismograph data, right, if we have data from 3 seismographs or 3 stations, we can pinpoint where the epicenter actually was, because we can use, trigonometry, which, it's like something I never thought I'd use again in my life until I started doing science in college. And so again, remember that SP arrival time tells you how far away each of the events is from each of the stations. So if we use that as the radius of a circle, we can draw a circle around the station, find where those 3 circles intersect to locate the epicenter of the earthquake. So here, for example, we have station 1, which we have as green here. It has an SP interval of 6.4 seconds. And if we use this diagram with the SP interval of 6.4, we get a distance of 52 kilometers. So we know that the epicenter is 52 kilometers away from that station. But we don't know what direction that epicenter is away from the station. It could be in any direction. So we draw a circle around our station with a radius of 52 kilometers, right? So the epicenter could have occurred within 52 kilometers in any direction of the station. Okay, so we have the second station, which is yellow, with an SP interval of 7.4, which if we use our seismic wave travel time diagram, we see has a distance of about 60 kilometers. So we can draw our circle with a radius of 60. Around that station, right, if we only have 2 stations of data, we still have 2 possible epicenter locations. So let's have a third station here in gray. It has a SP interval of 2.3 seconds and a distance then of 19. So then we know that our epicenter of our earthquake occurs here, where this red star is, using these seismic wave travel times inferred from the SP interval. All right, so we will do lots of hands-on activities about volcanoes and earthquakes to kind of get these concepts solidified for you.